Good morning, church. I had an amazing experience yesterday. I wish y'all could have been there. I had the opportunity to go downtown and be part of the Healing House baptism service, where we baptized, I think in the neighborhood of 60. People just kept coming. I think it may have been as many as 70 or 80 people who came to the Lord and made a public profession of faith. And of course, at the Healing House, these are folks that are just modeling the redemptive power of the gospel. Because in almost every case, they are coming out of hardship, out of addiction, prostitution, homelessness. And the joy of their baptisms were just an unbelievable blessing for me. We got to partner with our friends at Church of the Resurrection who are very involved in the Healing House as well. And it was just neat to see coming together as churches and as friends to be part of the redemptive story, what God is doing in the Healing House. Such an amazing story. And you're a big part of that. Your generosity to the Healing House. Bobby Joe literally said, she grabbed me by the shirt collar, and you said, "Tell them I said thank you." She loves you so much and so grateful for our partnership. So continue to pray for the Healing House and their ministry. You know, I want you to know another thing that really was important to me this week is I took my dog for a walk. That's it. I just wanted you to know I took my dog. No, I find, Wednesday morning, I was like, all right, I told the church, they got to go start a neighborhood group. I'm really pushing you to do that. So we committed to do this. We're doing ours on Monday nights at 6:30, and it's crazy. Our lives are crazy. I'm like, we're going to do this. And so I took my dog for a walk. My dog's not even a good walker. It's a bird dog. It's like, and I'm going around the neighborhood, and I prayed before I left the house. I said, Lord, I stink at this. I'm very nervous. I actually was very nervous. I'm thinking, if I'm this nervous, this would be horrifying for you guys too. But I went, and sure enough, I hadn't gone too far, and there's a neighbor on the street, and I invited him to join us. There were a couple ladies that I knew, which I was good with, and I invited them. They were, oh, that's awesome, I'm like, really? And so I'm coming down the street, and there's a woman, from India. She's got the red dot on her head. She's one of our neighbors. Her kids go to school with ours. And invited her, which was exciting. I think she was bewildered that I was even speaking to her, let alone inviting her to our home. And yesterday I went back out, met several neighbors I had never met before, had great conversations. And in every single instance, people were just grateful. They were grateful that I was speaking to them, grateful that I was inviting them to consider what we believe and to come and be in our home this fall. I actually am kind of looking forward to getting back out there tomorrow morning and just seeing who God's going to put on my path. I think we're going to need a bigger house. I think God's going to bless this. And so I just want you to know, you can do this. I know it's intimidating, but if you have a dog, take it for a walk. If you don't, just go for a walk. And pray before you go and let God begin to arrange divine appointments in your life to invite people to examine what they believe in the safety of your home and the space that you can create for a belief group. It's going to be life-changing. Listen, you've heard me say this before, but let me just remind you. What we believe to be true about God shapes every aspect of our worldview and determines our behavior and our attitudes. So nothing has the potential to change, to heal, and transform individuals, families, marriages, and cities like the truth about who God is and how much He loves us. And you have an opportunity to be front row in that this season as we go through the series Believe. This is kicking off on September 9th. You still have time. Grab some of the invitation cards, put your information on it, and just trust God. And I hope that you will, because it's going to be an awesome, awesome series that we're going to go through together, September 9th. Now, we're going to return to what we call the penultimate. That's the second to last message in the book of Acts. If you were with us last week, where we stopped, it was like stopping the movie right in the good part, right? Because this is a very dramatic scene that we're in. Let me just remind you, we're in Acts 27. A little history, if you're visiting with us for the first time, maybe you're not familiar with the book of Acts. Towards the end of the book of Acts, Paul is arrested under false charges, and he's in prison for 2 years in Caesarea. And then finally, after a couple bogus trials, he says, you know what, I'm just appealing to Caesar. I want my case to be tried by Caesar, which means he has to go all the way to Rome. And so jump ahead. He has been boarded on a ship with other prisoners to go to Rome. He has his friends, Luke and Aristarchus, are traveling with him. And this whole 27th chapter is the story of the sea voyage and then what results in a shipwreck. And so let me pull the map back up there. I apologize to our next service who's watching this. They can't see my pointer, so I'll just be as clear as I can. You can actually see the red line on the map and follow that. It starts at Caesarea. They go to Sidon, then the lee side of Cyprus, the east side of Cyprus, up to they coast along the shores of Cilicia. Tarsus there is Paul's hometown, Pamphylia. They stop here in Lycia in a city called Myra where they jump into an Alexandrian grain ship. I think we have a picture of the ship. That's generally what that ship is going to look like, probably bigger. It was the largest ship in the ancient world. It was a grain ship. Then they sailed slowly against prevailing northwest winds to Cnidus, at which point they can no longer head in a westerly direction. Their goal is to get to Italy, but they're going to have to take the long way. So they use the northwest winds as a crosswind. They go south to the lee side of Crete. They stop in a little harbor called Fair Havens, and there they have a little bit of a debate because it's now late in the fall. It's getting to be a dangerous time to be on the waters in the ancient world. Paul says, I think we ought to just spend the winter here. I have a bad feeling, I have a premonition that if we try to go any further, there's going to be trouble. And of course, he's outvoted by the ship's captain and the owner of the ship and Julius, the centurion. Let's throw the map back up there again. And so now their goal, on a nice day in the fall with a south wind, their goal is to hop out from the south tip of Fair Havens and travel northwest towards Phoenix, where they're going to spend the winter. But of course, as the story goes, as we read chapter 27, as they get started on this journey, they get out here in the open sea, and a huge squall kicks up from the northeast. They literally call this the nor'easter. We have that on the east coast of our country as well. It's an intense wind and storm. And the text says that they couldn't fight it. They had to give way to it. And they go on a southwesterly track. They get a little reprieve on the lee side of Cauda, where they pull up the ship's boat and secure the boat. But then they're going to be driven continuously southwest. And the text says that they're very fearful of running into the southern tip of Africa, which in the ancient world was called Syrtis. There's the lesser Syrtis and the greater Syrtis, and they're coming from northeast to southwest. And if they run into this area, they're going to never get out. It's very shallow and weedy. If they make it through there, they're going to end up busting against the rocks of northern Africa. So what they're going to do is a sailing tactic called they're going to heave to. If you're a sailor, you know what I'm talking about. They're going to heave to. They're going to lash the rudders to turn the boat directly to the north. If the winds come northeast, they're going to turn it directly to the north, not to the northeast. They don't want to take those waves on head on. They want to quarter them just a little bit. And they're going to basically try to make their drift a horizontal drift. I mean, broadside drift versus letting the boat go right with the wind. That should slow them down. It'll put them on a track that's going to be west by north by 8 degrees. That's kind of, as a sailor, that's kind of how you're going to think. This is going to keep them from running into the Syrtis, but it's going to send them out to sea. And that is where they are for days. They're in the storm. The storm's unrelenting. They're heaved to, and they're just drifting. The boat is filling up with water. They have lightened the boat of cargo and even thrown the ship's tackle overboard. And what we get to is at the end of our passage last week, it's just a very sobering record from Luke. He says, when neither the sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. So, I mean, once again, if you have the imagination, let the movie reel begin again. This is where we are. You know, mountains of water. You're talking about 50 to 60-foot waves. And even though this is the largest ship in the ancient world, it is being tossed around like a tiny little ship. They're thinking any moment we're going down. And this is going on for days. You can imagine the anxiety, the depression, the sense we're all going to die. But then at this moment when all hope is gone, the Apostle Paul steps up. And this is the last thing that we saw at the end of our passage last week. Paul addresses the men of the crew, everyone, 276 souls in this boat. He says, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.'" All right? So there's been this moment of hope. This is the only hope that these men have seen is the prisoner named Paul who steps up and says, "It's going to be okay. Yeah, the ship is going to wreck, but our lives will be spared. Take heart. Have faith." Now, this is probably 3 or 4 days into this terrible storm, into this drift. Now watch what happens where we pick up the story beginning here at verse 27. When the 14th night had come. The 14th night. As we were being driven along the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what's a fathom? And I'm going to tell you in just a minute. I'm going to keep you in suspense. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But for first, I have a question. Logic question. All right? You're sailing at midnight. No stars, no sun for weeks, which means in the ancient world, you are lost because they navigated by the sun and stars. Midnight. And the sailors perceive that they are nearing land. How? You're saying, well, they could smell it. No, they can't because the wind's coming from their back, from the ocean. How do they perceive? They can't see anything. How do they perceive that they're closing? Because there's no electronics, there's no sonar, no fish finder. Right? That's how I would know. This is the kind of question that James Smith, many of you might recall that I mentioned a book last week that I'd read on this, The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul, 1848. This man, James Smith, he was obsessed with the voyage and shipwreck. And he had nautical background, and he just went after this. And he began to ask these kind of questions. And the first question he said is, well, what would be the rate of drift? Because the rate of drift and the heaving to that ancient sailors would have done may give us a clue. And so he went and he asked 2 boat captains, literally just asked the question, what would you say would be the probable amount of drift of a ship hove to in a gale of wind? Of course, the captain said, well, how big is the ship? How fast is the wind? He said, big winds from the northeast, huge ship, Alexandrian grain ship. Got 2 different opinions. One said about 40 miles per day. The other one said maybe 24 miles a day. And so he split the difference. He said 36. He took 36 and a half miles a day. Then he did the research and he found out what is the distance from the Isle of Cauda, where they took shelter for a minute. What's the distance from there to the easternmost point of Malta? And it's 476 and a half miles. So you divide 476 and a half miles by 36 and a half miles a day. And what do you come up to? 13 days, 1 hour, and a couple minutes. And if you think about what Luke is saying, the first day of their journey was pretty good sailing till towards the end of that day, and that massive wind came, right? So they've been adrift on this course for just over 13 days. And that puts them right at the most eastern part of the island of Malta. Let me show you, we have just, well, here is, we've got, Cauda was down here, Malta is over here. Let's go to that other map. All right, now this is, I wish it was better, but this is water, and you can see that this is the easternmost point of Malta, Kora Point, all right? This is 476.5 miles from Cadiz. And this is probably where they are. We think almost certainly this is where they are. Why? Well, when you examine the evidence, there's other logs, testimonies from people who had shipwrecks in this area. And what they said about Kora Point is the land was so low that you would never see it from a distance. And particularly in hurricane conditions in the middle of the night, you never see it. So how did they know they were approaching Kora Point? They heard it because the surf was smashing against that point, that Kora Point, which sticks way, way out here. That's how everyone assumes that they discern that they were nearing land. And to this day, if you go and drop a line and take a sounding, right? I mean, that's how they do it. They just drop something heavy down there and count how far down. Right there, off of the point, is 120 feet, which is how many fathoms? 20 fathoms, right? Because fathom is 6 feet, right? So that's where they are, 20 fathoms off Kora Point. They can hear it. Now, they're on a drift that's heading west with the 8-degree north, which means they're going to pass right by Kora Point. They hear it. And then right here, you're at 15 fathoms. And now what does it say? They said they feared smashing against the rocks. Salmona Island is covered and guarded by huge precipices of rocks. And at that point, you're probably not only hearing it, but you might see just the spray of just massive waves crashing against that, which means they're getting close enough to where they know if we don't stop this boat right now, we're going to die. We're going to get smashed against those rocks. And so the text tells us that they lowered 4 anchors out of the stern, out of the back of the ship, and prayed that they would stop before they ran into those rocks. Now, it's just fascinating because if you were a sailor or any kind of a boater and you spend any time out in a boat, especially in windy or stormy conditions, you know if you're going to throw an anchor, you're going to throw it from the bow. So throwing it from the back with all that momentum going, you know, what you would typically do is you turn the bow into the wind, throw the anchor, and then drift back and hope that you can stop. They throw it from the stern. And the chance of a huge ship stopped by 4 anchors in hurricane force winds, it's like a 1% chance. I mean, Smith writes about this. He said their only chance of safety was to anchor, but to do so successfully in a gale wind on a lee shore requires not only time for preparation, but holding ground of extraordinary tenacity. I mean, you just have to have the perfect bottom for this to work. Turns out, on the eastern coast of Malta, off the bay of what's now called St. Paul's Bay, it was the perfect ground. Here's what it says from records from other sailors. The harbor of St. Paul is open to the easterly and northeast winds. It is, notwithstanding, safe for small ships, the ground generally being very good. And while the cables hold, there is no danger as the anchors will never start. In other words, they'll never move once they're down. Why is that? Well, there's 2 mountain streams that flow out of that area into the bay there that would kind of make its way around that eastern part of the coast. They're close to Salmona Island. And those 2 freshwater streams just pump out clay. And clay is exactly the bottom that you need if you're going to throw 4 anchors and stop a huge grain ship in hurricane force winds. It's the only thing that would stop you. Had that been a sandy bottom or a rocky bottom, they were all dead. Now, all I'm saying is there's a little bit of providence that's happening. God's going to allow a shipwreck, but it's going to be just the right kind of shipwreck. And that's exactly, you just watch the clues, and this is what's happening. Now, as they throw the anchors out, they're praying for daylight. This is just a flyer that they're going to survive this night. There's some Egyptian sailors who are not buying it. They're ready. These anchors are going to give way any second. Our boat's going to crash right against those rocks. We're all going to die. They're trying to escape. And so they're lowering down the boat. Look at what it says, verse 30. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat onto the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. I mean, you can hardly blame these Egyptian sailors. They just want out. They've been trapped in this boat for 2 weeks, thinking they were going to die. Now land is within sight, or it's close. They think those those anchors are going to give way, and they're all going to die. So they're trying to get into the ship's boat, the small boat they'd lower over the side. And Paul says it doesn't work that way. We all stay together or we all die, but we can't be saved. This was what God told me. Now, whether or not it was Paul's prophecy or, the soldiers were just really torqued at people trying to desert. They cut the ropes and the ship goes off, the boat goes off. So they're all together. Let's pick up the story. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. All right. This is an amazing scene. It's quite likely that the crew of this ship had not really eaten anything at all. There's two reasons. One, if you're being tossed around in 40-foot waves, you really don't have an appetite. Number two is it took all they could do to keep that boat from going down. This has just been day in and day out. And then three, their kitchen was beneath the deck, which means it was probably covered up in water, impossible to light a fire, impossible to create, meals for anybody on the ship. But now they're anchored, and Paul sees an opportunity to minister to souls that Jesus died to save. Doesn't matter who they are. And he has the confidence in the Lord. And even though he's a prisoner and the lowest standing on the ship, he rises up and he serves as a leader, because that's what Christians do in times like this. He has hope, and he takes bread, and he blesses it, and he breaks it. He just looks like Jesus, doesn't he? The longer we watch Paul, the more like Jesus he looks. And that is the path of sanctification for all of us. The longer we're believers, the more we're tried and tested, the more our lives should look like Jesus. And he gives them the Last Supper. Literally. This is the Last Supper they're ever going to have on this boat, right? This boat is going down tomorrow. There's no question in anybody's mind. There's no point in saving any of the grain. It's all going to end up at the bottom of the sea anyways. They jettison everything because this is a big ship, drafts a lot of water. And so tomorrow, when they make their run for the coast, they want it to be as light as possible. So that's all historically makes sense, right? Now, let's see what's going to happen. Verse 39. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. If this was a movie, this is like the moment, like you just don't go to the bathroom, right? This is so intense. It's very dramatic as the sun makes its way and they begin to see. And this was the whole point of throwing the anchors from the stern, is so as soon as they could see, they could pick their point that they're going to aim for. They don't have to try to turn the boat around because the boat's already aimed with that wind pushing behind them. They're going to loose the ropes that were holding the boat solid with those anchors. They're going to throw those into the sea. Remember, this boat had two long paddles that served as the rudders. They had taken those up and bound them up so they wouldn't get crushed by the anchor ropes. So they're going to loose those and put them back in the water. They're going to hoist the sail that's right on the bow. It's just a little sail, but just enough to give them some power and some steerage. And they're going to guide that boat, and they're going to shoot for this little strip of beach where there's no rocks. That's the plan, right? It's a great plan, except that when you go into what is St. Paul's Bay today, there's a shallow reef right there. And they didn't even get very close to the shore before they ran aground on the shallow reef. Now, if you've ever been to Mexico or places where there's a great coral reef, you know that stuff is rock hard. And if your boat, which is wooden, runs into a coral reef, you're going to get bashed to pieces, or a rocky reef. But this is the perfect kind of reef. It's a clay reef, right? Which means that big old boat got stuck in the mud. It's totally just stuck, but it didn't get, wrecked. The bow didn't, so you have some integrity up there in the front of the boat. But all those waves are crashing in behind it, and slowly but surely, that boat is getting pulled apart. It could have been worse. There's This is actually not a bad scenario, because every time those waves are busting out the back of the ship, it's creating flotation devices, for people who can't swim. And they can actually step off the boat onto this shallow bar and pick their path and take their little piece of plank or wood and make their way. There's only one problem. The Romans had a policy on any kind of a prisoner ship that if this situation came about, the soldiers were to kill all the prisoners to ensure that none would escape. Let's see what happens about that. Verse 42. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought to safety to land, brought safely to land. Now, as shipwrecks go, you could have not had a better morning, right? This just worked out as well as it possibly could. And the most remarkable thing that happens that morning is that this Roman centurion makes the call, a call that could cost him his life or his career for sure, to not have the prisoners executed. Why? Because he had developed a relationship with Paul. How? Because Paul, as a follower of Jesus, loved his enemy, showed kindness to those who persecuted him. That happened early on when they met. We don't even know. Maybe Julius had been part of Paul's life for the years when he was in Caesarea. We don't know. But there was a relationship there. And that relationship saved all those men. Certainly saved Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus. By the way, we wouldn't even have the book of Acts, and probably not even the Gospel of Luke, had any one of these details not turned out exactly the way that they did. All right? So this is a remarkable story. They all get to shore. They're safe and sound. And it's an amazing thing to see the way that they're welcomed. I'm looking for that. Okay, so here we are, chapter 28, verse 1. After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened onto his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead, but when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. All right? This is really a remarkable story. Luke says, he confirms the island is called Malta. He says there's natives on the island. All right? These would not be considered, sophisticated people. 2,000 years ago, you talk about natives on an island. These are going to be, generally unsophisticated people, but they're very warm and hospitable. They welcome 276 men, some who are prisoners, some who are Roman soldiers, and so on, Egyptians, and they welcome them to the island. What they've just witnessed from shore is nothing short of a miracle, to see these men make it in that storm and all get to shore safely. They light fires, and I love that Luke says, because it was starting to rain and it was cold. Well, they'd been in rain for 2 solid weeks, right? I don't think the men cared about the rain. They were just happy to be on land. But man, can you imagine how good a fire felt after all that? Until, of course, the snake comes out and bites you in the hand. And what's amazing is just the irony that's in the text that the Maltese natives pick up on immediately. You get this, right? I mean, here's a man they just watched, along with all the others, who survived being out in that massive storm that's been sitting off the shore, for several days. He just survived a shipwreck where the ship was being beaten to pieces, and they all managed to get here. And now, as he's sitting near the fire, he gets bit by a poisonous snake. He's going to die. They said, that's justice. This man, because Paul's dressed like a prisoner, he's probably shackled again by now. They're looking at him and say, well, he must have been a murderer. And though he escaped the sea, now justice has caught up with him and he's going to die. Now, I can't pass this up. This is too good. Do you understand what we just saw here? This is a historical record from 2,000 years ago that in a place called Malta, where there were natives, probably very uneducated, very uncivilized people, they inherently, intuitively knew, as do all people, that justice is a thing. Justice, it will come after those who have done acts of injustice, which is to say that there is a moral law. We know what it is, and you break that law, justice is going to come and get you. Do you understand how important that is for the apologetic of the existence of God and the fact that human beings are not machines and they're not animals and they're not... we know that there is a law, the natural law, the moral law. In every civilization, you could have been shipwrecked on any island anywhere in the world 2,000 years ago or even today. In every culture and civilization, they all know this. Justice is a thing. There is a moral law. And when you break it, when you do acts of injustice, there's going to be a reckoning. That is the worldview of just about every single human being who's ever lived, every community throughout the history of the world. And you see an example, a 2,000-year-old example of that here on the island of Malta. Now, the natives are so certain that the snake has come to deliver justice that when Paul doesn't swell up and die, they're like, oh, you must be a god, right? It just gives you a little bit of idea of, the ancient kind of superstition. But it is kind of remarkable that Paul doesn't die, that he doesn't even swell up. Now, it's possible that this snake was not poisonous, but these natives have seen snakes before, and they know what snakes do. And the word viper here is a word that indicates a poisonous snake. Now, if you went to Malta today, it's a very developed island. They say there are no poisonous snakes in Malta. There's hardly any trees. But 2,000 years ago, this was a different island. And I suspect this was a poisonous snake. So Paul has drawn quite a bit of attention now. And let's see what happens next, verse 7. Now, in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. Now, it's interesting, Luke says us. Did he entertain 276 men for 3 days? I don't think so. We're talking about a small group that was with Julius. And I think at this point we should assume Paul has earned the respect of every man on that ship. He's earned the respect of Julius, right? Because he's the only guy who had hope on that ship. He's the one who prophesied that they would all make it, but the ship would be destroyed. He was the guy who led the Last Supper. I mean, Paul is like a rock star now on that ship. And now, amongst all the natives, he's also like a god, right? He just survived a snake bite. So Julius is like, Paul, you're my man. You stay with me, Luke and Aristarchus. And now they get this fine treatment. They're with the chief man of the island, this man named Publius. That was a title probably given to him by the Romans. This man, though, is probably a native. His family owns lands on the island. His father lives on the island, as we'll see, which means, this is a native man who now holds a position for the Romans. Look at verse 8. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honored us greatly, and when we were about to set sail, they put on board whatever we needed. All right. Now just go back into this place. All this stuff has happened. Paul is sitting there with Publius, the chief man, and Julius, the centurion, and Luke and Aristarchus. They're having dinner, and this man offhandedly mentions, yeah, my dad lives here, and he's really sick. He's dying. He's got dysentery. He's had this terrible fever. Paul sees a ministry opportunity. And he says, hey, could I go visit your dad? I'm sure Publius was like, what? And so he takes Paul to see his dad, and Paul just does what he does. He's just being himself. He visits with the man. He prays for him in the name of Jesus Christ. He lays hands on the sick man, which nobody would have done, and he heals him. He does ministry. This was a fortunate shipwreck for Publius' father, right? If that ship doesn't wreck, he dies. A terrible, slow, terrible death. Dysentery, smelling like urine, fever. But because of the shipwreck, Paul lays hands on him, and this man is made whole. But it gets better. Word gets out that Paul healed the chief man's father. And now the natives are all bringing their sick people to Paul, and he's doing ministry. He's been stuck in a jail cell for 2 years. He's been stuck on a ship for 2 weeks, but now he's doing ministry. Once again, he feels the power of the Holy Spirit working through him to bring about healing, to proclaim the gospel in this place he never dreamed he would be. that he didn't even try to get there on purpose. It was a fortunate shipwreck, wasn't it? For all those people. Church, have you ever stopped to consider that what you consider a shipwreck in your life may actually be the means by which God is going to bring healing to the world? I mean, just think about that for a moment. Paul had the opportunity to bring the gospel to Malta. Lives were healed, forever changed because of shipwreck that Paul did not desire or deserve. And yet, because he was faithful, as we look at it now, it almost looks like God planned the whole thing. Now, does God plan shipwrecks? No, but God doesn't waste shipwrecks either. Some of you are thinking, Jim, I'm not sure that's good theology. Well, let's consider the evidence. Consider Exhibit A, the life of Jesus Christ. Betrayed, denied, falsely accused, arrested, beaten, whipped, crucified, shipwrecked. But by his death and resurrection, he conquered death and saved the world. Exhibit B, the life of Paul. Former terrorist turned Christian, hated, despised, stoned, left for dead, falsely accused, arrested, martyred, shipwrecked. But he spread the gospel throughout the world and gave us 13 letters in the New Testament. Exhibit C, Martin Luther King, preacher, visionary, sinful man, adulterer, hated, harassed, arrested, murdered, shipwrecked. But he championed the civil rights movement, anchored in the gospel, and introduced God-honoring change in America in terms of racial equality. Exhibit D, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, brilliant teacher, pastor, leader, writer, arrested, executed, shipwrecked. But he gave us the cost of discipleship and demonstrated what true faithfulness looked like during the Holocaust. Exhibit E, Horatio Spafford, brilliant businessman, wonderful Christian family, lots of kids. Fire in Chicago destroys his house, his business, he loses everything. So he sends his wife and his daughters on a ship across the Atlantic for some vacation. They're going to join D.L. Moody in doing mission work, but halfway across the North Atlantic, the ship goes down. Only his wife survives. He loses his daughters. But he gave us the song after that, "It Is Well With My Soul." Church, please quit thinking that Jesus saved you for calm waters and easy sailing. That's simply not true. Jesus saved you, and Jesus saved me, so that when we are caught up in the storms of life, we will step up and speak up with words of hope, because we belong to God, and we believe what he said, regardless of how bleak the circumstances might look. Jesus saved us so that when our shipwrecks, we will be true to the gospel and bring help, hope, and healing to those we meet in a place we least expected to be. Face it, shipwreck in this life is inevitable. It's not because you're incompetent. It's not because God is angry with you. It's exactly what Jesus said. In this life, you will have trouble. It is inevitable, as are the squalls that we find at sea. This is just the world in which we live. None of us will escape shipwreck. I mean, the question is this: what are we going to do with the time that we have in the place where we are? Will we sit around and feel sorry for ourselves that this was not where I wanted to be? This is not where I set out to be. This is, like of no fault of my own. Look at where I am now. Or will we allow God to work miracles through our lives in the place where we are, regardless of how we got here? I wonder what it would take for us as a church, as families, as individuals, to realize the biblical story that many hurting people in this world will never experience the healing power of Jesus Christ until our ship grinds to a halt, gets bashed to pieces, and we float ashore, saved by grace, grateful, and suddenly available. Available. Think about that, church. Will you pray with me? Lord, these stories raise many questions. But what's clear in Scripture is that you have a plan for our lives. And we may get ourselves in all kinds of mess or even be subject to other people's mess that leads us into a storm, and suddenly our lives don't look like what we thought they would. It feels like shipwreck. It looks like shipwreck. It's harrowing. But as believers, Lord, help us to believe that you give us just the right kind of a shipwreck. One that will deliver us to a new place, a place we did not choose, but a place that has purpose. A place where you will use our faith in our life to minister to people who might not otherwise ever see Jesus. I pray that you would be a God who redeems our wreck, and that we would be people who would give you glory in the heart of the storm, in the places we didn't plan to be. That we would trust your providence and your sovereignty in our lives, even now. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.